Welcome into the Ben Burnett Show. My name is Ben Burnett. I want to thank my sponsor for this fourth season, Chiringa. If you are in downtown Alpharetta or going to Blue Mountain Beach down on 30A, go see my buddies Travis and Andy. If you like frozen drinks, that's a place for you. My guest today is New York Times Magazine columnist Robert Draper. Robert, welcome in.
Hey, thanks so much, Ben.
Well, I want to say it is a timely, you are a very timely guest, and we did not plan to orchestrate this anyway, but that's just how it kind of works out. Can you start for just a couple minutes and tell us who you are, where you grew up, what got you interested in journalism, that whole thing, and then when you moved to D.C. and made the big switch?
Sure, Ben. First of all, just to correct the record a little bit, I'm not a columnist for the New York Times Magazine. I write these unreadably long political features. So I report and write. I don't opine. And my opinions, as you're about to find out, aren't terribly original or interesting. But I split my time between writing for the Times Magazine and writing for National Geographic, both of which I've been working for since about 2007. I'm a native Texan. I was born and raised in Houston. My grandfather was a rather famous attorney in Houston, the Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski.
Oh, wow.
Went to the University of Texas at Austin. Like a lot of people who go to Austin, took my time finding my way out of that city. Worked for a magazine called Texas Monthly, was hired away from them after about 7 years to write for GQ magazine, and then decided to write about my former governor, who was at that point running for re-election as president, George W. Bush. I moved to Washington to do a book on him. Spent a great deal of time in the Bush White House and with President Bush. And it was on the heels of the success of that book, Dead Certain, that I was hired by the Times and National Geographic, and here I am.
That is a lot to get to in 2 minutes. So you've done us a great service. Well, I think one of the interesting things. So I was in college when George W. Bush was the 43rd president of the United States. Mm-hmm. Fortunate to grow up in a military family where I didn't necessarily know my dad's opinions or leanings until he was out. How did you first get into covering the then governor? What were the avenues to do that? Because look, the Bushes and the Kennedys and those types of families, there's only a handful of them in American theater or American politics. You can pick whichever adjective you want to use. How do you come to find yourself covering him on a daily basis? And what was that like, covering a family that had such nostalgia? Nostalgia may be the wrong word, just such an aura about them.
Such a pedigree, right? I wasn't during my 7 years at Texas Monthly really a political writer. I wrote about a lot of different things, crime and punishment and social issues and just basic profiles, but did do a couple of political pieces. And it was during my time at Texas Monthly that George W. Bush became elected governor. And in 1995, I remember he came into the offices of Texas Monthly and had a lengthy bull session with all the writers and editors there. Was a pretty, prickly guy, had a lot of swagger to him, and said that he had all this political capital and he intended to spend it, a line that he would use a lot in his presidency.
Yes.
When I moved over to GQ in 97, it was sort of understood that if Bush decided to run for president, that I'd be the guy who would write about him. I'd had a few pleasant run-ins with then Governor Bush throughout the mid-90s. And so I got assigned to do this story on him in 98, spent a great deal of time with him, with his father, with his wife, his mother, and with Carl Rove, Karen Hughes, and others in his inner circle. And I think that formed the basis of what I guess you would call not so much a relationship, but at least, a collegial understanding of each other. I decided when Bush got elected president in 2000 that I wasn't going to be one of these Texas journalists who hung his entire career on the hook of Bush and just kind of went about my business. But by 2004, when it was clear, at least to me, that no one was no one who was doing a biography of Bush really understood him to the degree that I believe that I did, that I appointed myself as biographer. And it was, as you're suggesting, been an interesting experience. The Bushes do have this remarkable pedigree of public service. They're very wary, to say the least, of the press. George W. in particular was the enforcer of, around his father when his father was vice president and president, and often got into it with reporters. But I found that once I did manage to get Bush's attention, and ultimately did 6 one-hour interviews with him for my book in the White House, that he was very, very expansive. I mean, he'd often begin the interviews by putting me in my place, saying that I was wearing a crappy tie, or that, why didn't I shine my shoes or something. But once it was established who was the big dog in the room, then he would field any and all questions. And there's a lot I can say on the subject of Bush, and I not only said it in that book, but also said it in a book that was published last year, and which will be out in paperback in a couple of weeks,
right?
About Bush's decision to invade Iraq.
Well, so talk to me just briefly about when you say, he would make some sort of not defamating statement, so that he knew who the big dog was and the enforcer. Did you get to know him on a personal basis at all, or did he always keep the people that covered him closely at an arm's length?
No, actually, what you see is what you get with Bush for the most part, and what you do not tend to see in public, that you do see one-on-one with George W., is that he actually has a very aggressive intellect. He can be incurious, famously so, and I think that got him in trouble in the run-up to the Iraq invasion. But when there is something that engages him, he is really all over it. He fires questions at you. He tends to find the weak link in your argument or in your rhetoric, and pounce on it. He has a good sense of humor. He can be very, very self-deprecating.
Yeah.
His body language gives him away. He's the world's worst poker player. It's evident, what he's thinking, just from the way he slouches or the smirks on his face or something. And he could be very emotional. He was a crying president. I mean, he said that to me. He said, "I'm a crier." And I also think, Ben, as a final thing, that whatever else one will say about Bush, I've always felt it's meaningful when the people around an individual love working for that person. And that was the case with Bush. He did not tend to place the blame on other people. He didn't throw people under the bus. He didn't, take out his bad day on people, and just a very, very straightforward guy. And, there's a lot negative one can say about his presidency, but these are among the positive personal characteristics that I found in him.
Well, his presidency was certainly, I think if you look back, I think every president has some sort of crisis or event. If it's a 4-year, I think Trump and Biden, as history judges it in 20 years, will be remembered for the pandemic, right, wrong, or indifferent. Bush is synonymous, clearly, with 9/11. There are those defining marks in American history and how people choose to respond. But you had alluded to the team and the people who worked for him. He wouldn't throw them under the bus. Can you talk about the access that you had to the Ari Fleischer, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld type of people that he surrounded himself with, and his father surrounded himself with much of them in many of the same ways? It seemed like their team was always relatively consistent. Colin Powell may even be another, and all these people, they come and they go in certain varieties. But can you talk about your access and your relationships to some of those people and how they helped personify who he was?
Yeah, I interviewed every single one of them, of his senior staffers, for my biography of Bush, and many of them multiple times. And then for the book that I did on Iraq, I interviewed a number of them as well. Bush and Cheney did not participate in that book. Cheney, because I think he said all he cared to say on the subject of Iraq. Bush, because Bush didn't like my previous book on him. I think it was quite fair, but fairness is not always what the sum total of what people want, even if they claim that's what they want out of journalism. But I think that there are a lot of things you can say about the people that Bush surrounded himself with. It's sort of axiomatic that in the second term, a president tends to get what presidents, what he really wants in a cabinet. The first one is kind of to, check a few boxes, politically speaking. Bush entered office, you'll recall, having lost the popular vote.
Yes.
It was understood that he might in many ways be a weak president. He didn't have any foreign policy experience, and therefore he has, as vice president, Dick Cheney, who fulfilled two objectives for Bush. First, he was truly a master of foreign policy, and for that matter of the Hill, having been a minority whip. And secondly, Cheney didn't want the job of president himself, and so that was somewhat reassuring to Bush. And he also had Colin Powell, who was the most popular political figure in America at that time. And but Powell and Bush never developed the relationship that Bush did with Cheney, and for that matter with his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. And of course, Bush was famously close to his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice,
yes,
who later would become his Secretary of State.
I spent a great deal of time valeting cars in Birmingham, Alabama, and I cannot tell you, I have valeted her vehicle at least 36 times. It's been years and years, but she was always extremely gracious and, was appreciative of the fact that there were people out there willing to do that. But I remember the first time I saw her thinking, and I'd seen her clearly through the news and the eyes of the media, like the people that he surrounded himself with, even if you didn't agree with him from a philosophical perspective, they were all very intelligent politicians and political minds.
Extremely. And in fact, I would say, Ben, that one of the great tragedies of the Iraq saga is that it is very much akin to Halberstam's narrative of the Vietnam War, the best and the brightest, that JFK surrounded himself with brilliant individuals, but it becomes kind of an object lesson in what brilliance gets you and what it doesn't get you, what experience gets you and what doesn't. Donald Rumsfeld, for example, the recently departed Donald Rumsfeld, was the most qualified Secretary of Defense in history when Bush picked him because he'd already served the position once before. The problem was that Rumsfeld had been out of government for something like 20 years, had really no sense of the dynamic of Islamic extremism. That was a limitation that was common to all of Bush's senior foreign policy team. They tended to think in terms of great powers and the Cold War,
yep,
and all that. And so, but you can't say that what did Bush and his team in vis-a-vis Iraq was a lack of intelligence or even a lack of experience. It was just their failure to apply those.
So you said Islamic extremism. So you are clearly familiar with the man in the cabinet when 9/11 happens. How closely were you to that team, even from a coverage standpoint, on that day? And how quickly did you have to ingratiate yourself back into the inner workings of a day in and day out, knowing that the United States overnight had absolutely changed?
Yeah, well, so a couple of things. First, I wasn't yet working on the book. I began working on the book just around the time that Bush won his reelection. I was actually jogging in Central Park when the first tower came down. And wow. I reacted to that the way everyone living in New York did. I just happened to be there that day and it took several days for me to be able to get back to back away from New York. But I mean, you're right to focus on 9/11 because it changed the entire trajectory of Bush's presidency. He was really fated up until then to be a domestic president. He was a governor. That's what he knew. He knew Mexico. He wasn't intending to go to war with anybody. For all these people who say that he invaded Iraq to settle an old familial score with Saddam, who had tried to assassinate his father in 1993, there's really no evidence whatsoever to support that. I mean, Bush didn't like Saddam, would have been delighted to see somebody else take him out, but wasn't going to spend his presidency, certainly didn't intend to at least, hugging war widows just to settle an old family score. But 9/11, forced him to take a crash course in Islamic extremism and really even, the just sort of global dynamics, geopolitics writ large.
When you get into that place in 2004, there's clearly several years behind them. What's the rationale that they used for people from Pakistan and Afghanistan and other parts of the world that clearly had ties to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden? How did they make that transition and justify that to say it's Iraq? That's where it's not that I want to push back on you, but I think the family argument is so easy to say he wanted to settle a score, and for somebody that doesn't pay attention, it's a very easy connection to make because, candidly, I kind of feel that way because if you know anything about the Arab world, they're very disparate factions. Then the thing that the Arab world is best at is being disorganized.
Yeah. Well, so I did not say that the matter of Saddam trying to assassinate Bush's father was irrelevant. I just said it wasn't dispositive. I think that it was basically the muscle memory that George W. Bush brought to the White House, which is Saddam's a bad dude. He tried to take out my dad. I'm going to keep an eye on this guy, and he better not cross me. But I think that's where he was. Then 9/11 occurs, and the Bush team is focused in an almost frenetic way of trying to prevent what they are certain will be a second wave of terrorist attacks. The question is, what's it going to be? Who's it going to be from? And very early on, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, plants in Bush's head the notion that it could very well be Saddam. That Saddam has had historic ties to Al-Qaeda, which, by the way, is not true, at least not from an operational level. But that was the case that Wolfowitz and others were making. And so very early on, Wolfowitz succeeded in getting Saddam back on Bush's frame of vision. And Bush concentrated in that first month and a half after 9/11 on going after the Taliban, who had given refuge to Osama bin Laden, and indeed trying to get bin Laden himself, obviously, as we know, not successfully. But then he turned his attention to what he said would be the next front in the war on terrorism, and that's when he gave this famous Axis of Evil speech, in which he, called out Saddam, Iran, and North Korea, saying that each of them had sort of dallied with terror groups in the past, but it didn't take much, close analysis of that speech to notice that he devoted one sentence to North Korea, one sentence to Iran, and a couple paragraphs to Saddam. It was evident who he was setting his sights on. And they, not just he, but the entire government apparatus had a very, very, corrosive view of Saddam. He was a bad guy. He was terrible to his people. The flaws, however, in that thinking were twofold. First, the notion that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction was true in 1990 and the beginning of 91, but it wasn't true after that, and there was no evidence to support that it was true. The second problem then was that even if he did have WMD, lots of people have weapons. That doesn't mean they're going to use them against the one remaining superpower. And the notion that Saddam Hussein would go on a suicide mission by attacking the U.S. was unsupported by any intelligence whatsoever. But that was the leap of the imagination that Bush and those around him made, that Saddam would like nothing better to do this. Well, there was, again, no evidence to support that. In fact, a lot of evidence to suggest that Saddam wanted to be our ally in the war on terror, as my book discloses. I mean, that's what Saddam was talking to his people about. I want to be with the big guys, and that will elevate my status. But Saddam was a survivor, and you don't get to be a survivor by attacking superpowers.
Not in that culture. You don't. You're not going to do a lot of good dead. And I would argue, we're not going to dispute that he was a good man. He wasn't. Oh. But let me ask you a question. So Saddam Hussein knowingly gassed his own people in the Kurds in northern Iraq. So we agree there. Right. So if there are WMDs, quote unquote, chemical weapons, we can call them whatever you want, it doesn't matter. In the span of 20 years, they disappear into what seems to be thin air by all the UN weapons inspectors and teams. But in your heart of hearts, where do you think they went? Because we don't dispute that they existed. We know that they clearly did at one point. What do you think? Do you think they made their way into Syria? Do you think that they were, he was aligned with Assad? He knew that things were going south? Because the UN is well documented in their ability not to do anything quickly.
Well, no, but I don't need to think. I actually know where they went. They were all destroyed in 1991. Or by 1992 at the latest. I think that's when the last chemical weapons were destroyed. And they were destroyed on orders of Saddam. There are UN records that indicate all of this. As my book discloses, the military scientists offered, I think in 1992, to take the United Nations weapons inspection team around to all the biological labs where they had destroyed everything. And they dropped the ball and never did that. The evidence of that Iraq had actually disclosed in 1992 where all of its biological weapons had been was completely forgotten until a UN inspector in 2008 happened to be clearing out the files. And so Saddam had eliminated all of this stuff. Now he didn't. The reason he didn't come clean on it was that he wanted the Iranians to think that he had it. And there is some evidence to suggest pretty strongly that Saddam, when all of the sanctions were lifted, would want to crank up his chemical weapons program again for defensive purposes, because he was scared stiff of Iran, a much bigger country. Yes. But at minimum, he certainly wanted the Iranians to think that he possessed that capability, but he didn't.
When you talked, and you mentioned the name Wolfowitz, when you look at him, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney, did they begin their operation in Iraq with any plan whatsoever? Or because there's still, you don't have to wonder if there's still remnants. Syria is largely in disarray because the United States government left a vacuum over there. What is your... between those three people, can you talk about the responsibilities that you feel like each of them had or encouraged? Because I live with the assumption that Dick Cheney was always a hawk who was never too far from having his finger on the trigger.
Right. Well, it's those three all present interesting test cases because they're all very different in terms of their motivations. Cheney saw Saddam, who he dealt with when he was Secretary of Defense, Cheney in the first Bush administration, as a malevolent actor, and on top of which he felt that the United States needed to project force and show the world, show its enemies that it meant business. The democratization of the Middle East and of Iraq in particular meant really nothing to Cheney. He didn't care about that. He wanted to show force. Rumsfeld wanted to show force too, but he was actually agnostic on the whole issue of Iraq. And interestingly, when asked by Bush whether or not he thought it was advisable to invade Iraq, Rumsfeld dodged the question. He actually never, which is very infuriatingly typical of Rumsfeld. He tended to answer questions with questions. If you asked him, won't there be a lot of unintended consequences of going to war in the Middle East? His answer would be, well, won't there be a lot of unintended consequences if we don't go to war in the Middle East? That kind of thing. And now Wolfowitz is the one person whose motives and means were clear and very transparent because he'd been arguing them throughout the 1990s. Which was that he believed that Saddam needed to be overthrown. He preferred that it be done by the Iraqis themselves with financial support and perhaps some military assistance of the Americans. And he wanted to see the Iraqis govern themselves, preferably his buddy Ahmad Chalabi, the famous Iraqi refugee. But if not Chalabi, then someone of that stripe, some Iraqi expat. But none of them foresaw, unfortunately, the difficulty, not so much of invading. In fact, they believed there would be a lot of difficulty invading because they believed that Saddam had weapons that he would use against us. They thought it'd be, however, famously a cakewalk once we did invade, that the Iraqi citizens would jubilantly coalesce around this new democracy, whoever was in charge of it, and whatever sectarian tensions existed between the Shia and the Sunnis would be put aside for the sake of democracy. This was all kind of crazy and not borne out by any real understanding of the history of that country, but it's something they all embraced in the manner of wishful thinking.
Or the thousands of years of history that had predated that.
Yeah. So it's no, and Rumsfeld's role in all of this was that he believed that we should invade with as small invading force as possible and get out as quickly as we could. And as he would say, take our hands off the bicycle seat and let the Iraqis ride the bicycle themselves, learn how to ride themselves, which of course is a kind of condescending way of describing Iraqis, but also a very, I think, dangerous thing to do, to go in and, like a bull in a china shop, and then leave the china shop to, leave the employees of the shattered china shop to figure out, how to put the pieces back together.
As a part of his cabinet and really conflict management style, and I mean military conflict, do you think that there was a lot of self-interest among those people in his cabinet, or do you feel that they were trying to take the country in a harmonious, unison direction with respect to military force? Because one of the things, and you said it, that Rumsfeld wanted a small tactical force. I think if you talk to an active duty Marine, their synopsis is, you should use us when you plan to win, and you should begin with the end in mind. That,
yeah.
Unpack a little bit of that for me.
Well, sure. I mean, Rumsfeld, in fairness to him and even to his credit, did a decent job of setting in motion the transformation of the military, which is a hoary institution, possessed of groupthink, and it was characteristic of Rumsfeld and his, at times exasperating brilliance, that he asked a lot of outside the box questions, lots of why do we need this, why do we need that. He rejected on its face the theory that then Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Colin Powell espoused during the first Gulf War, that of the overwhelming force, coming with everything you've got, basically. Rumsfeld thought he was a very parsimonious, fastidious guy, very old-fashioned in that regard. And he believed that was wasteful, wasteful and, of course, destructive. And he thought that we should be more laser-like about things. So that was, to the extent that Rumsfeld had any real belief system, any real theology that related to the Iraq War, that was it. Get in, get out as quickly as one can. And I think that, I guess you can argue, and certain people have, that Rumsfeld couldn't wait to try out that theology on a country. But, again, I will emphasize that Rumsfeld at no point ever, outwardly espoused the invasion of Iraq the way his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, did. And when you're asking about like motives, I do want to say that since it's been charged over and over again that the Bushies did this for the oil, and to enrich their friends in the oil and gas business. I just didn't see any evidence of that. I mean,
Sure.
I know that people will find me credulous for saying that, but I'm not suggesting that they didn't see that as useful. But it's also the case that Poland, for example, when they were offering to commit troops to in the coalition of the willing, basically said, we'll commit troops, but we'd kind of like to be cut in on the oil. And the Bush administration said, we can't do that. I mean, this is it's the Iraqis. They own the oil, and it will be helped to finance the reconstruction of that country. So there's, walking backwards or forwards, there's really no persuasive evidence that was uppermost in the minds of anybody in the Bush administration.
I want to shift gears with you, unless you have anything else you want to go through in there. I'm happy to, because you would know 100 times more than I could do on my best day. But so we met because you emailed me as an elected official with with respect to a book that you are working on today, or thoughts of a book and interviews that you're doing today on why Georgia and why Arizona flipped from Republican to Democrat. What gave you where did that idea get planted with respect to you as your work as a biographer or a journalist, so to speak? What interested that about you with respect to the 2020 election cycle, and what makes these two states so interesting?
Sure. I mean, just to adjust how you framed that, my book is actually about the Republican Party in the wake of Trump's presidency. I'm not going to say the post-Trump Republican Party because I think that Trump is still a dominant factor, if not the dominant factor in the GOP. But I'm focusing in particular on the two critical states that flipped for the Democrats because Georgia and Arizona, because those were close, because they offer object lessons in what the Trumpy version of the Republican Party did wrong, and they also are interesting case studies in where the Republican Party will go forward. Will it be, in Georgia's case, the more conventional Republican Party reflected by Brian Kemp, or by the kind of torch and pitchfork version espoused by freshman Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene? And in Arizona, you could say the same thing about Governor Ducey and say Paul Gosar, who came in with the Tea Party wave. And while it's interesting to see a lot of those Tea Party congressmen change over time, Gosar, if anything, has moved farther to the right. I should mention also, Ben, that the book that I did right after my first book on Bush was about the Tea Party freshman class, and in a lot of ways, this book I'm doing now is a kind of sequel to it. It's though I'm adjusting the geography and focusing, on Washington, Georgia, and Arizona rather than just Washington. But I do think that it's not an original line of inquiry, but I think it's an important one nonetheless of which direction the Republican Party will go in, and Trump. Kind of, you'll recall well that after the 2012 election, the party descended into meditation, saying how we've turned off a lot of voters. How do we get them back? Reince Priebus was the head of the Republican National Committee and launched this Growth and Opportunity Project. And among the big planks of it was, we got to court Hispanics. We got to, we've got to find a way to attract Latinos. Trump showed another path, which was, no, we don't have to do any of that stuff. We just have to, gin up our base. We have to excite them, and along the way find low propensity voters. And that will come at the expense of a lot of these other voters that the Reince Priebuses of the world wanted us to attract. But in a lot of ways, it's more intellectually honest to be Republicans and talk to the people who always loved us than to try to persuade people who disliked us. And so that's what Trumpism offered. Then again, he lost the popular vote twice. And it remains a very open question whether the Trump version of the Republican Party is of the kind that can win national elections as opposed to a heavily gerrymandered district like Marjorie Greene's.
Do you believe that, and there are two prevailing thoughts. So I am under the belief that people in droves over the next 20 years are moving to population centers. I mean, when the census finally comes out, you're going to absolutely see it. But, and I think a lot of that's taken place over the last 10 years. Which prevailing thought, and I know Mark Cuban refers to those Trump voters that you mentioned earlier as, he calls them the lower right. And that, is that used in somewhat of a, insincere way to do it, but sure, but he's not necessarily wrong either. Those low propensity voters that don't turn out, you gave them a boogeyman, and he did that incredibly well in the first wave, and he knew where he had to go to win, fractions of points in certain media markets, so that his path to victory, that was the only one that existed, was, and he executed on it. He bought right outside of major media markets where he could still have access to those people that maybe had lower incomes. Do you believe that this ends in a fundamental reconstruction of the Republican Party, or do you think it's going to take another cycle? And do you think the polarization continues, or do you think that you see the Joe Manchin school of thought reach across the aisle, let's get something done. In the evidence of what you're writing about, and I know that you're not necessarily in the business of offering opinions, which path do you forecast? Do you think that the Republicans get their act together in the suburbs, in these big metropolitan markets, or do you think they're going to continue to go and find, the extra 100 people in precincts and markets where, people don't turn out in droves to vote? Which school of thought is going to win the day?
Well, I don't think I don't think that the Republicans have lost the suburbs for good. I mean, for one thing, that was evident in 2020 when a lot of House seats that were predicted to swing over to the Democrats because they were heavily suburbanized did not, in fact, flip, and stayed with the Republicans. So there's that, and it's clear that from a strategic standpoint, that what the Republicans are trying to do is, frankly, scare a lot of suburban voters by saying, that, like you hear Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy use the word crisis over and over to refer to, the state that we're in. It's not terribly convincing, but because the economy is on the rebound and, businesses are opening back up. But he's saying, there is a crisis at the border, and there's a crisis in our dealing with China, and there is a crime crisis, a new crime wave, and so the hope is that suburbanites will feel vulnerable to those, and they could. Look, what was manifestly clear was that Trump turned off a lot of people, a lot of professionals, a lot of women in the suburbs. There's just no getting around that. All of the exit polls, confirm that.
Absolutely.
But that's very, that's very specific to Trump himself, but then that leads to the question, Ben, does the Republican Party gain back suburban voters with no kind of, with Trump nowhere near, the ticket, not running again, not having much of an influence, and yet at the same time managed to hang on to these low propensity voters that were uniquely drawn to Trump? I think it's, I think that pollsters from the Republican Party have indicated to me that they think the low propensity voters will still come out as long as the Republican elected officials and pundits convince the electorate that the stakes are existential, that if they don't vote, they can forget about their way of life. Their guns will be grabbed. Their, cancer culture will throw all them out of their workplaces, and China will take over everything, and we'll be a socialist nation, a socialist godless nation. And so that's, if that's clearly what a lot of Republicans are angling to sell these low propensity voters on, and we'll see if it works. To answer your first question, I don't think it is going to be evident by November 2022 which version of the Republican Party holds out, but I think that a lot of the forces at work will become clear by November 2022. So here's the thing, they're, I think, 5 or so House seats away from regaining the majority. The Republicans are. They can regain those in all likelihood just through redistricting, and assuming they don't, that they don't incur a net loss in all the other seats. And so then what does that prove, other than just the craftiness of the redistrictors? It doesn't prove that Trumpism sells. It doesn't prove that it doesn't sell. But I do think that we will be seeing, for example, like Marjorie Greene in Georgia 14 is not vulnerable.
No.
That's her fiefdom now for as long as she wants it. But we'll see in some of the Senate seats. That's in Ohio. Ohio is in all likelihood safe, but say in Pennsylvania or something, it's not altogether clear that a Trumpy candidate is going to win there, and Mitch McConnell is very aware of that, and in his effort to become majority leader, is doing his best to put his thumb on the scale. So we'll see what prevails there.
Well, I will end here. So there's somebody that I know you're probably intimately familiar with Congresswoman Liz Cheney from Wyoming, and probably to a lesser degree, Adam Kinzinger from Illinois. Do those people, those elected officials, do you feel that they are about to be in the eye of the hurricane with respect to their political futures? Is coming out so vehemently against Donald Trump going to wind up costing them their seats? Because Liz Cheney and the Cheney family are, they're not the Kennedys and they're not the Bushes, but they are a known quantity. Do you think that that those two have something to really worry about? Do you think that the Trump effect against them in their district is going to be a real thing? And on November whatever it is in 2022, are they still going to be standing up because people saw through it, or is it top down, take the gloves off, we're getting rid of them no matter what the cost is?
Well, starting with Kinzinger, the point I think is a moot one because I don't think he's going to have his district left. In Illinois, the redistricting process is not absolutely certain, but pretty certain to wipe out the district that he holds. So we'll never know if it's death by Trumpism. It's probably just death by gerrymandering in his particular case. In the case of Liz Cheney, she's in for a real fight. I mean, I've been to Wyoming to talk to her electorate and to talk to the sort of grassroots activists there. They loathe her, the loud voices. But this is deceptive. I mean, and there are two things working in her favor. One of them is that some of it's the Cheney name and pedigree, but a lot of it's just the Cheney experience. That Liz Cheney has really carried the water for the Wyoming electorate. She's done a lot of good things there, and I'm not sure that people like this guy, the septic tank operator, who was the first out of the gate to announce that he was running against her, is going to be able to do well by Wyomingites to that degree. The second thing in her favor is that there's probably going to be a lot of people running against her. And so they're going to split up the Trump vote, lead to a runoff with her against one of the others. Or rather, there isn't going to be a runoff. Sorry. It's in Wyoming, it's basically whoever comes out ahead is the nominee, and of course there's no Democratic Party to speak of, so whoever wins the nomination will be elected. But it's really, really hard to tell, Ben, and no one's quite sure how it will shake out. Her agreeing to the appointment on Nancy Pelosi's January 6th select committee,
yep.
May be honorable. It also may be politically suicidal. It's certainly a hand. It is a gift to Trump, who wants so desperately to take Liz Cheney out. A great talking point that she is much, much closer in alignment to Nancy Pelosi and the Socialist Democrats than she is to true conservatives.
Well, Mr. Draper, I want to thank you for your time today. I appreciate your work, your insight onto the Bush administration and your career. And best of luck to you. You're welcome anytime. Have a great day, sir.
Thanks. You as well, Ben.